Lucas Carter was an investigative journalist with a knack for uncovering stories others ignored. At the newsroom where he worked, he was always the first to volunteer for any story about disappearances, strange sightings, or urban legends. One Tuesday afternoon, while sifting through old files, he stumbled upon a newspaper clipping from 1972. It was about a city called Covington that had mysteriously vanished from maps. The article claimed that the town had been completely abandoned, and since then, no one seemed to remember it existed. Intrigued, Lucas decided to dig deeper. He searched maps, but Covington didn't show up on any recent ones, and even historical records about the town were vague. It was as if the town had been erased from existence. That only piqued his curiosity more. After a few hours of online searches, he found the name of a man mentioned in the article, Samuel Richards, described as the last resident of Covington. Richards had been a scientist involved in some special project in the 1970s, but the details were scarce. As he continued his research, Lucas found an old photograph. It showed Covington's main street, with a gas station, a diner, and a young woman standing next to a sign. He zoomed in on her face. There was something unsettling about her gaze, an enigmatic look that seemed to transcend time. It bothered him, but it also fueled his curiosity. He kept wondering what she knew, what secrets the town held, and how he could expose them to the world. Lucas printed the photo and pinned it to the wall beside other clippings from his investigations. The photo unsettled him. As he examined it closely, he noticed the young woman wore clothes typical of the 1970s, but her face was timeless, showing no signs of age. He searched for her name on the internet but found only one other photo of her, this time in black and white, apparently taken around 1952. Lucas widened his eyes, realizing it was the same woman, with the same serene expression, the same enigmatic smile. She hadn't aged a day in 20 years. It was impossible. A chill ran down his spine, and he knew, at that moment, he had to find that town and uncover what lay beneath its mystery. The next morning, Lucas decided to make the trip. He meticulously researched Covington's probable location, tracing a route based on old geographical descriptions and the clues from the news clippings he'd found. He packed a camera, his voice recorder, a notepad, and set off in his car. During the drive, he tried to imagine what he'd find there. A ghost town? Ruins covered in vegetation? Or maybe nothing at all, just empty land where life once was. After several hours on the road, Lucas arrived at the spot where Covington was supposed to be. As he looked around, he saw only a dense fog covering the landscape ahead. He felt a slight dizziness and hesitated, but his curiosity pushed him forward. As he walked, the fog grew thicker, almost tangible. He felt a weight on his shoulders, as if the air around him was closing in. As he crossed through the fog, he had a strange sensation, like he was breaking through an invisible barrier. Suddenly, he found himself on a street that seemed straight out of an old photograph. There it was, Covington, frozen in time. The gas station still bore the same sign from 50 years ago, and the diner looked as if it was ready to open its doors. Lucas moved forward cautiously, observing every detail. The windows were shut, but he felt the invisible gaze of someone watching him. He noticed a curtain twitch in one of the houses but couldn't make out anyone behind it. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through him. It was like he was in a horror movie, where every step might reveal a hidden truth. He walked up to the diner from the photograph. The door was slightly ajar, creaking lightly in the breeze. Inside, the scene was even more disturbing. The tables were set, with glasses and silverware, as if customers had left in a hurry, abandoning everything. On one of the tables lay an open newspaper, dated 1972, and he wondered if someone had really left it there over 50 years ago. He touched the paper and felt its aged texture, though it was still intact. Nothing made sense, but that only made him feel more drawn to the mystery. He left the diner and continued walking down the main street, taking in every detail. It was clear that time had stopped in Covington, but how? And why? Lucas knew he had to find out. He felt he was close to something big, something that could change the way people saw reality. He looked back at the fog, remembering the strange sensation as he crossed it, and knew there was no turning back now. He was there to uncover the mystery, and nothing would make him leave now. Lucas walked down Covington's main street, feeling like an intruder in a place forgotten by time. Around him, everything looked peculiarly preserved. The buildings, with their painted facades and wooden signs, seemed to belong to another era, yet nothing showed signs of decay. He approached the gas station, where the old fuel pumps were perfectly maintained, with the display still showing prices and cents. A heavy silence filled the air, making every step he took echo, as if the whole town were listening to his presence. Looking around, Lucas noticed signs of life, despite the apparent lack of movement. There was an old newspaper in front of a door, a bicycle leaning against the wall of a grocery store, and wilted flowers planted in a ceramic pot. He felt as though he was being watched, yet he saw no one. It was as if time had really stopped there, as if Covington were trapped in a faded photograph. The air was thick, and he realized that the fog that had brought him to this place had now dispersed, leaving him completely isolated. He tried to remember the way back, but everything looked different, as if the streets had shifted while he explored. Lucas made his way to the diner he had seen in the photograph. The door was slightly ajar, and he slipped in quietly, his steps creaking on the wooden floor. Inside, the scene was even more unsettling. The tables were set with plates and silverware, as if customers had suddenly abandoned everything. On one of the tables lay an open newspaper dated 1972, which made him wonder if someone had really left it there 50 years ago. He picked up the newspaper and felt the texture of the old paper, still intact. None of it made sense, but the mystery only drew him in further. As he explored the diner, he noticed an old radio on the counter. He turned the knob, but it was dead silent, as if it had never been used. He glanced around and saw a framed photograph on the wall. It was an image of a group of people standing in front of the diner, probably the residents of Covington. He recognized the young woman from the photograph that had led him there, but now she was surrounded by others who also appeared strangely youthful. Lucas felt a chill as he realized that many of the faces in the photo were ones he had seen in his research, with no signs of aging. It was as if time had truly stood still for everyone who inhabited the town. Suddenly, he heard a noise outside and hurried back out. Lucas looked in the direction of the sound and saw a woman who seemed vaguely familiar. She had the same eyes he had seen in the photograph. He knew it was her, the young woman who appeared in every image. He approached her cautiously, unsure of what to expect, but she quickly turned and began walking in the opposite direction. Lucas hesitated for a moment, but then decided to follow her, keeping a safe distance. She walked with a calmness, as if she knew he would follow. They passed a series of buildings that looked like residences, with closed windows and locked doors. The woman turned a corner, and Lucas followed, only to realize that the street they were on was an exact replica of the main street. It was as if the town were folding in on itself. He began to feel a slight dizziness, the same sensation he had experienced when he crossed the fog. He tried to orient himself, but everything around him seemed displaced. The woman finally stopped in front of a peculiar-looking house, with large windows and curtains that completely blocked the view inside. She looked at him, and Lucas felt something in her gaze that both attracted and unnerved him at the same time. She finally spoke, her voice low and filled with an inexplicable sadness, "You shouldn't be here." The phrase echoed in his mind, and he felt a wave of disorientation wash over him. Before he could respond, the woman stepped into the house and closed the door, leaving Lucas alone on the empty street. He tried to move forward, but a feeling of loss overwhelmed him. Lucas knew he needed answers, but he also understood that Covington held more secrets than he could have imagined. He sensed that, somehow, the woman knew he was there, perhaps even knew his fate. He glanced around, and the silence of the town seemed to weigh on him like never before. He tried to force open the door of the house, but it was firmly locked. He stepped back and began walking down the street again, feeling like a pawn in a game he didn't understand. As he walked, Lucas noticed that the houses around him seemed to shift slightly. The facades, which had seemed orderly before, now looked out of place. It was as if the town were shaping itself to confuse him, to make him feel even more vulnerable. He forced himself to stay calm and kept walking, trying to memorize every detail, every corner, but the feeling of being lost only grew. Lucas was beginning to realize that Covington was no ordinary place, and that time here didn't work as it did in the rest of the world. He returned to the main street, but the scene was no longer the same. The gas station now seemed farther away, and the diner had disappeared from view. Lucas knew he had to keep his focus if he wanted to understand what was happening. He took a deep breath and looked up at the sky, which was eerily still, with no clouds, no wind, as if the very air was trapped along with him in this town. The only thing he knew for certain was that he wasn't alone. Something was watching him, and he felt that every step he took led him deeper into a mystery from which there might be no return. Lucas kept wandering the streets of Covington, feeling as though the town was wrapping itself around him. He could still feel the weight of the woman's gaze, and he knew that her words, "You shouldn't be here," meant more than a simple warning. There was something in her tone, a hint of foreboding, as if she understood the fate of anyone who dared to cross through that fog. The town, though seemingly empty, felt alive with unseen presences. As he walked, he had the sense that shadows were moving in his peripheral vision. Glancing down the street, he saw a figure standing at a distance, watching him. It was an elderly man, pale, with an empty expression, dressed in clothes from another time. Lucas took a few steps toward him, but the man turned slowly and disappeared down an alley. It was as if every inhabitant moved within their own space, following some secret, invisible routine. Determined to find more answers, Lucas continued down the street until he found a shop that looked like it was still in use. The shelves were stocked with goods, many of them in cans and boxes that dated back decades. He picked up a can of soup and examined the label. The expiration date was from 1974, but the product looked brand new, as if time hadn't touched it. Beside him, a shelf displayed a collection of old newspapers, all from the same era. He flipped through a few and noticed that every edition covered news about Covington, with no mention of anything beyond the town. As he was reading, an older woman entered the shop. She had gray hair and walked with slow, measured steps. A chill ran down his spine when he realized she looked identical to someone from the photograph he'd seen in the diner. He couldn't understand how it was possible, but it was clear that the town was hiding something that defied time. He tried to start a conversation, asking what people did here, but the woman only gave him an ambiguous smile and replied, "We're living, just like everyone else." Then, with a delicate motion, she picked up a bag of coffee from the shelf and left, leaving Lucas even more baffled. As he exited the shop, Lucas spotted the young woman again. She was standing next to an old car, seemingly oblivious to his presence. He approached her cautiously, unsure of what he was dealing with, but she eventually turned to face him. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sad, as if they held the weight of an ancient secret. Lucas knew that she was the key to understanding this place, but he didn't know how to approach her without feeling like an intruder. "Did you come here looking for answers?" she asked, her voice older than her appearance suggested. Lucas nodded, trying to mask his nerves. The woman took a step toward him, studying him carefully. "Not everyone who comes to Covington can leave," she said, her words carrying the weight of a sentence. Lucas could sense that he was standing before someone who knew far more than she would ever reveal. He pressed her for more information, but the woman only sighed. "We're trapped here," she said, with a tone of resignation. "Everything you see, every building, every street, it's all part of something bigger, something that wasn't meant to be understood." Lucas felt a chill, wanting to know more about what she meant. He asked about the experiments, about Samuel Richards, and how it was possible that people didn't age, but she didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked at him with a resigned expression, as if she had long since given up hope of ever escaping. Lucas insisted, asking about time and about life inside the town. She explained in vague terms that Covington was no longer a part of the outside world. "We're in a bubble," she said, her gaze distant. "Time doesn't pass here like it does anywhere else. It's like we're frozen, always waiting for something that never arrives." Lucas felt a mixture of fear and fascination. He knew he was starting to understand, but there were still missing pieces. He wanted to know who had put them there and why. But before he could ask, she stepped away, turning to continue on her path. Lucas sensed that the woman knew of his curiosity, but that she was somehow prevented from revealing more than she should. He tried to follow her, but she vanished into the fog that was beginning to rise again, cloaking the town in a thick layer of mystery. He knew he needed more information, and something inside him told him that those answers lay somewhere within the town, waiting to be found. Returning to the main street, Lucas began to question what was really going on. He knew that Covington held secrets that defied comprehension, and that the inhabitants seemed to be caught in some endless existence, like pieces in a complex machine. He felt he had to dig deeper, to discover the details of the experiment and understand how this place had been created and what its true purpose was. As he walked, he started to wonder about his own arrival in the town. Had it really been his choice? Or had something guided him here, knowing he could never leave? Lucas looked around, feeling that every corner, every shadow, every detail was watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. He knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, but something inside him compelled him to continue, driven by a thirst for answers that only drew him further into this unsolvable mystery. Lucas knew that if he wanted to understand what kept Covington trapped in time, he'd need to find something more tangible than cryptic looks and the residents' vague answers. He remembered a building he'd glimpsed earlier, just after entering the town. It was a low structure, hidden behind trees and surrounded by a rusty fence. It looked like a public facility, maybe an old factory or storage depot. He felt a strange pull toward it, as if the place held the answers he was searching for. He moved quickly toward it, trying to ignore the growing feeling that he was being followed. As he got closer, he noticed the faded words "Covington Research Facility" painted above the door. A pair of metal double doors blocked the entrance, but one of the side windows was broken, making it easy for him to slip inside. Lucas squeezed through, careful not to make too much noise, and was hit by a wave of stale air and dust. Inside, it was dark, and the air smelled of mildew, like no one had stepped foot in there for decades. The main corridor was littered with papers, clipboards, and broken furniture. Lucas picked up a few documents and realized they were scientific reports, though much of the text was smudged and illegible. He managed to make out a few words and phrases, like cell rejuvenation, government experiment, and sample 72B. His eyes scanned the clipboards, and he saw black and white photos of people who looked frozen in time. Some of them were familiar, faces he'd seen on the streets of the town, like the old man and the woman from the shop. A chill ran down his spine. It was clear that Covington had been the site of some kind of experiment involving its own residents, but he still didn't understand the full extent of it. He continued down the hall until he reached a room where the air felt colder and heavier. Inside, he found rows of files on metal shelves, all covered in a thick layer of dust. He grabbed one of the files and opened it, revealing detailed records of tests conducted on volunteers. Some of the documents mentioned an experimental substance referred to as Agent X9, which supposedly aimed to slow down the aging process. As he read, he heard a noise behind him and quickly turned, but there was no one there. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and he knew he had to hurry. He sifted through more papers and found a dossier marked Samuel Richards. This was the scientist he'd read about in the news articles. The document described Richards as the lead scientist behind the experiments, detailing a series of tests he'd conducted on himself to prove the effectiveness of Agent X9. Lucas flipped through the pages, absorbing the information. Richards had believed the substance could halt aging, but at some point, things had gone terribly wrong. On the last page, Lucas found a personal journal entry from Richards, where he described how the experiment had spiraled out of control. He mentioned that the effects of the substance had somehow spread throughout the entire town, creating a sort of temporal field that affected all the residents of Covington. Lucas realized that Richards had no idea how to reverse the effects and that, in trying to isolate the town, he and the residents had become trapped inside it, suspended in a never-ending time loop. A sense of urgency swept over Lucas, and he decided to take some of the documents with him for further analysis. As he stuffed the pages into his pocket, he noticed a red button on the wall with a sign that read "Activate Containment Protocol." He hesitated, but his curiosity won out. He pressed the button and immediately heard a mechanical sound, as if some part of the facility was coming to life. At the far end of the corridor, a previously blocked door swung open, revealing a more protected laboratory, almost untouched by time. Lucas stepped inside and was confronted with a row of glass tanks, each filled with a greenish liquid that bubbled softly. Inside each tank, he saw human figures in suspended animation, as if they were in some kind of deep sleep. He approached one of the tanks and recognized the face of Sophia, the young woman who had warned him about Covington. His heart raced. She was there, untouched, floating in a preserved state that defied all logic. He looked at the other tanks and saw more familiar faces, all residents he had seen around town, each of them caught in some kind of eternal stasis. It all began to make sense. He now understood that Covington was more than just a strange town, it was a prison of human experiments, where time and life were suspended, manipulated by a process he still couldn't fully grasp. But he also knew he couldn't escape without first understanding how to undo it. He tried to open one of the tanks, but the structure was locked by a security system he didn't know how to access. With each passing second, he felt more trapped, as if the laboratory walls were closing in on him. Lucas returned to the hallway, trying to find another exit, but he realized the layout of the laboratory had shifted. The doors seemed to be changing positions, and he could no longer tell where he had entered. It was as if the building itself were alive, conspiring to keep him there. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but doubt and fear began to take over his mind. He didn't know how much longer he could keep his composure in this situation. It was clear that Covington, or whoever controlled it, wasn't going to let him go so easily. He continued down the hallway until he found another room with a control panel covered in buttons and levers. One of the monitors displayed real-time footage of the town. Lucas recognized the main street and the houses he'd passed earlier. He saw figures moving, but when he focused, he noticed they were repeating the same movements in a loop, as if the town were staging an infinite performance. It was disturbing, and he felt his mind spinning with the possibility that maybe everyone was just there to repeat the same gestures, forever. Driven by a new sense of determination, Lucas decided he needed to escape before he, too, became trapped in the cycle. He sprinted toward the exit, and as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him. He found himself back on the street, the air heavy and stifling. He tried to catch his breath, but everything around him felt wrong, as if the town had changed again in his absence. He knew he couldn't trust his senses, but he had to keep looking for a way out. He glanced at the fog that was beginning to surround him again, as if it were alive, blocking any hope of escape. Lucas knew he was trapped in Covington, but he still didn't know how or for how long. He felt like he was close to the answers, but the town was determined to hide the truth from him. And as he walked back to the main street, he realized that time was running out, even in a place where time seemed to have stopped. With each step, he knew he was sinking deeper into the mystery of Covington, a place where no one aged and where everyone was condemned to an eternal prison. Lucas felt the weight of the knowledge he just uncovered as he walked through the streets of Covington. He knew now that the town was a prison, and that its residents were living experiments trapped in time. But all he wanted now was to escape. The sense that the place was folding in around him, like a shifting maze, grew stronger with every step. He tried to retrace his way out of town, but he quickly noticed that the streets had changed, as if Covington had reorganized itself to disorient him. He returned to the gas station, using it as a reference point, but something was wrong. The fuel pump seemed out of place, and the sign now displayed an old design, different from what he'd seen before. Lucas tried to ignore the growing discomfort, focusing instead on finding an exit. The feeling of being watched persisted, but he was used to that by now. The real challenge was facing a space that seemed to be distorting itself to block his escape. After a few minutes of walking, Lucas found a street he believed was the way out. He took a deep breath and began following it, but soon realized that everything around him was repeating. The same houses, with the same windows and doors, appeared again, as if he were walking in circles. He checked his watch and saw that the hands hadn't moved. Time seemed to be caught in that loop as well. Lucas knew something was wrong. He was moving, but he wasn't really going anywhere. The fog began to rise again, thick and heavy, making it difficult to see. As he tried to push through it, Lucas realized that this fog was different from the one he'd crossed earlier. It felt resistant to his movements, creating an invisible barrier that held him within Covington's limits. He felt a slight pressure in his chest and sensed that if he continued, something would pull him back. He took a deep breath, trying to focus, but desperation was creeping into his thoughts. He felt cornered, as if the town itself were alive and intent on keeping him trapped. Suddenly, he heard footsteps in the distance. Lucas turned around and saw the figure of a man approaching. It was the same elderly man he'd seen earlier, the one with the blank expression and distant gaze. The man stopped a few meters away, watching him in silence. Lucas sensed that this man was part of the town's mechanism, a piece of the puzzle that moved according to a logic he couldn't grasp. When he tried to get closer, the man vanished into the fog, leaving only the feeling that Lucas was being guided by forces beyond his control. In a moment of panic, Lucas began to run, but his footsteps echoed emptily in the deserted streets. He felt the air grow heavier with each step, as if the very ground were trying to hold him back. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the fog closing around him, transforming the path he'd taken into a blank, endless maze. He no longer knew where he was going, but he felt compelled to keep moving forward. Every street he turned down seemed to bring him back to the starting point, as if the town were rearranging itself to keep him there forever. In the midst of his frantic run, Lucas spotted the young woman from the photograph, Sophia, standing next to an old building, watching him with a look of pity. He rushed over to her, breathless, hoping she could offer some kind of help or guidance. "You need to stop," she said, her voice calm and low. "The town won't let you leave." Lucas felt a surge of despair. He insisted that he had to find a way to escape, but Sophia only shook her head sadly. "The town is alive," she continued. "Every piece of it is connected, and we're all tied to it. Covington was built to hold us, and no one leaves without paying the price." Lucas tried to argue, but he could feel the weight of her words. "You came here seeking answers, but Covington demands a steep price for them." She looked at the fog surrounding them and added, "With every attempt to escape, the town grows stronger. Each time you try to leave, it takes another step closer to holding you forever." Lucas felt she was speaking more than just in metaphors. The town really did seem alive, like an entity that fed on the escape attempts of those trapped inside. He backed away from her, trying to think of an alternative. Lucas knew he couldn't continue in this cycle. He had to find a way to outsmart the town's hold. But with each failed attempt, he felt as though the town knew him better, understood his fears and his determination, reshaping itself to crush any hope of escape. He decided to return to the laboratory where he'd found the suspension tanks. He believed that if he could understand the technology behind them, maybe he could reverse the process or at least create an opening to get out. Lucas moved quickly, but he felt as though time was against him. With each corner he turned, the town seemed narrower, the streets shorter, as if everything around him was closing in. He arrived at the building and forced his way inside, finding the door half open as if it were waiting for him. Inside, the laboratory seemed even more deserted and ominous. He walked back to the control panel where he'd seen images of the townsfolk moving in repetitive cycles. He touched the monitor, trying to figure out a way to use the system to his advantage. But when he pressed the buttons, the images flickered and went blank, replaced by a warning sound. Lucas heard doors slamming shut throughout the building. He tried to run, but he realized he was trapped. The building was shifting again, altering its layout to confuse him even further. He heard voices echoing faintly, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Covington was trying to communicate with him, to show him there was no way out. Lucas backed away and decided to make one last attempt to get outside. When he reached the main door, he felt an invisible force blocking his way. It was as if he were pushing against an unseen wall, something that refused to let him cross the threshold. He threw himself against it, but the barrier repelled him with a force that sent him stumbling back. Once outside on the street again, Lucas realized that Sophia had vanished. He was alone once more, surrounded by the thick fog that pulsed with its own energy. He started to lose his strength, feeling that the time in Covington wasn't just a prison, but a force that drained his will. He no longer knew how long he'd been there, whether it had been hours or days. Despair started to turn into resignation, and he realized that Sophia might have been right. The town was alive, and he was now part of it. As he walked, he saw the same buildings, the same windows, the same doors. Lucas knew that as long as he was there, he could never return to the world he once knew. Covington wouldn't let anyone escape, and he felt himself becoming more and more a part of that timeless prison. Finally, he stopped, exhausted, staring at the fog that surrounded him. He felt himself being absorbed by the town, integrated into the endless cycle that held everyone within. With a final breath, Lucas accepted his fate, knowing he was now just another shadow among Covington's eternal residents. Lucas wandered the streets of Covington, feeling the weight of defeat with each step. The town felt larger, more oppressive, as though it had expanded to fully enclose him. He could still feel the presence of that woman's gaze on him, and he knew that her warning about the town had been more than just a vague threat. Her words echoed in his mind, and he felt as if there was no longer any way out. But after a while, he realized he had to try one last thing, to find Sophia again. He made his way to a square he'd noticed earlier, where leafless trees surrounded an old gazebo at the center. As he got closer, Lucas spotted Sophia sitting on one of the benches, gazing into the distance with that same haunted look. He hesitated for a moment, but he knew he needed to speak with her. He approached cautiously, fearing she might vanish like she had before. But this time, she noticed him and nodded for him to sit beside her. "Sophia," he began, feeling the weight of his words as he spoke, "I know you understand this place better than I do. I know you know what's really going on here." She looked at him with a mix of sadness and resignation, as though she had long since lost hope. "Lucas," she replied, her voice soft and heavy with melancholy, "Covington isn't what it seems. All of us here, we're part of something that should never have started." Lucas listened closely as Sophia explained. She told him about Samuel Richards' experiments and how Covington's residents had become volunteers, drawn in by the promise of immortality. At first, everything seemed promising. Richards believed he could stop aging, creating a community that would remain forever young. But something went wrong. The substance they were supposed to test was more powerful than anyone anticipated, and it somehow spread throughout the entire town, turning Covington into an isolated bubble where time and aging didn't behave as they did in the outside world. Sophia explained that although they didn't physically age, there was a steep price for immortality. "We're trapped, Lucas," she said, staring at the gazebo as if she were seeing something invisible. "Every day is the same, but we feel the time slipping by, even though it doesn't move forward. It's a cycle, and the more you try to escape, the deeper you get." She sighed, closing her eyes as if she wished to escape that reality. "Our punishment is to live forever, but without truly living. Here, we're only shadows of who we once were." Lucas felt a wave of sadness and fear at her words. He asked how Sophia had survived for so long without losing her sanity, but she just smiled, a hollow smile. "The town changes us," she replied. "The longer you stay, the more you become part of it. In the end, you don't even want to fight. Covington becomes all you know, and the world outside, it fades away, like a distant dream." For a moment, Lucas considered the possibility that Sophia had been there so long she couldn't even remember the outside world anymore. He asked how she had come to Covington and why she hadn't tried to leave, but Sophia only shook her head, as if she knew that explaining wouldn't make a difference. "Some of us tried," she said, "but we all failed. Each attempt pulls us further into this cycle, and the town grows stronger. It feeds us, but it also feeds on us." Lucas looked around and noticed that the town seemed more alive than before. The trees, the buildings, even the air itself all seemed to pulse with an energy he had never felt anywhere else. Covington was more than just a town, it was a being that consumed him, feeding on the despair of those who came there. He understood that Sophia was right. With each attempt to escape, Covington held him tighter. "What if we just stopped trying?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Sophia looked at him with compassion. "That's what we all end up doing in the end. Covington changes us. Eventually, we give in. We accept that this is our home now, and we stop fighting." Lucas felt the weight of those words, realizing that she no longer saw Covington as a prison, but as an inevitable part of her existence. She was indeed a shadow of what she once had been, a survivor of an experiment that had spiraled out of human control. He wondered if the same fate awaited him, if he, too, would become part of the town, just another shadow, suspended forever between time and life. Sophia fell silent, and Lucas knew that the conversation had reached its end. He stood up, looking at her one last time, feeling that he had finally grasped something fundamental about Covington and the fate it held for those within. It was impossible to escape, but it was also impossible to fully accept that fate. The town was transforming him, and he didn't know how long it would take until he was completely integrated into that cycle. Lucas walked away slowly from the square, processing what he had just learned. He understood now that Covington was a perfect trap, designed to capture those who sought answers to questions that should never have been asked. He'd come seeking truth, but had only found more questions. He wondered if Samuel Richards was still there, wandering the fog, watching the town he had created, which now held him as tightly as everyone else. Lucas felt he was close to a bigger revelation, but he also knew that any attempt to go further would only drag him deeper into this mystery without an end. As he walked, Sophia's words echoed in his mind. He realized that Covington was not just a prison for the residents, but also a prison for time itself. The town existed in a space where time had been manipulated, twisted, to serve a purpose no one understood anymore. It was an anomaly, a glitch in the flow of reality, and Lucas was now at its heart, with no way out. Returning to the main street, he looked toward the horizon, where the fog was rising again, and accepted that escape was impossible. Lucas felt that after his conversation with Sophia, there was only one thing left to do: uncover the whole truth about Covington, no matter how dark it was. He knew something was still missing, a final piece that connected all the town's residents and their fates to Samuel Richards' experiment. Recalling the documents he'd found in the lab, he decided to go back there, even though he suspected the town would try to stop him. As he approached the building, Lucas noticed the air was heavier, almost tangible, as if the space around him was compressing to block his path. He ignored the sensation and slipped back inside through the same side window. Once in the lab, the silence was thick, broken only by the echo of his footsteps down the empty halls. He knew exactly where he needed to go, the archive room. If there were answers, they would be there, waiting for him among the dusty, forgotten files. He began rifling through the drawers, looking for any mention of his own name or something that might link him to the town. Minutes passed as he skimmed through report after report, all detailing Richard's experiments, but none that seemed to involve him directly. Finally, in the last drawer, he found a folder marked Supplemental Candidates. He opened it, and there it was, a photograph of him, dated decades earlier. It was impossible, yet there it was, his own face, the same eyes staring back, as if fate had always meant for him to be there. Stunned, Lucas continued reading the document. The notes described a group of individuals selected for a second phase of the experiment, people chosen not for their desire to be immortal, but for certain traits that would help them adapt to Covington's temporal cycle. He read the words over and over, as the truth unraveled before him. Somehow, he had always been part of this plan. He had been drawn to Covington, like a piece that would complete the puzzle, a final test to understand the boundaries of the time loop that consumed the town. He staggered backward, feeling betrayed by forces he couldn't even comprehend. Suddenly, everything made sense, the streets bending around him, the fog that blocked his way out, the residents who looked at him as though they knew things he never could. He was part of this experiment, not just a visitor who had stumbled upon it by accident. Lucas felt anger and frustration rise within him, mixed with despair. He realized that control over his own life had been an illusion and that, from the moment he'd crossed through the fog, he had been bound to Covington forever. But he still needed one final answer. How could there be a picture of him, from decades ago, in a place he had never been? Lucas began to search the documents again, looking for anything that could explain this anomaly. He came across a note about something called selective temporal reversion, a process that allowed scientists to manipulate an individual's memories and experiences, integrating them into an alternate timeline. According to Richards, the process worked like a retroactive inclusion, where the subject's past was molded so that they had always belonged there. Understanding the extent of the experiment, Lucas felt the ground fall away beneath him. Richards hadn't just manipulated time, he had recreated Lucas's reality. When he arrived in Covington, he hadn't remembered fragments of the past, those memories had been implanted in him. Covington wasn't just a town outside of time, it was a town that altered time, reshaping each resident's perception and destiny according to its own rules. Lucas sat down on the floor, breathing heavily. He knew that trying to escape was useless, but he also understood that he had to do something to break the cycle. Then he thought of Sophia and the others, all stuck in this endless repetition. He knew he wasn't the first to try and leave, but maybe he could be the first to try something else, to change Covington from within. He looked around, searching for any device or mechanism that might let him interfere with the cycle. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he had to try. He found a control panel hidden behind a shelf. The buttons and levers looked ancient, but they still functioned. Lucas began pressing a few controls, trying to locate the system that generated the temporal field. He found a lever marked stabilization. He hesitated, but he knew he had no other choice. He pulled the lever, and immediately felt a shift in the air, as if the very fabric of reality around him was tearing apart. The lab began to shake, and he heard a low, constant hum, like the heartbeat of Covington itself reacting to his interference. The lights flickered, and Lucas realized he had activated something beyond his control. He bolted for the door, feeling the floor tremble beneath him, and saw that the fog around the town was momentarily clearing, revealing the horizon beyond Covington. But then the fog closed back in, thicker and more impenetrable than before. He returned to the square where he had last seen Sophia, hoping to find her, but she was gone. Lucas looked around, but the people of Covington had vanished, as though the entire town had reacted to what he'd done. A crushing sense of loneliness washed over him, but also a strange sense of purpose. The town knew who he was, and he knew that his presence was essential to keeping the cycle intact. But Lucas didn't want to be just a cog in the machine. He knew that if he stayed, he would be absorbed into the town, but he also knew he had one last chance to alter what was happening. Determined, he returned to the lab and began pushing more buttons, trying to destabilize the system beyond repair. If he couldn't leave, he would destroy Covington from the inside, breaking the cycle that held everyone prisoner. He knew time was against him, but his determination kept him moving. He felt the walls of the lab closing in, and the town resisting him with every button he pressed, but Lucas didn't stop. Covington might try to stop him, but he was willing to do anything to free himself, even if it meant destroying himself. The sound in the lab reached a deafening pitch, and Lucas knew he had reached the point of no return. He looked around, realizing that his very existence was at stake, but also that he had done something no one else had dared. He closed his eyes, bracing for the impact, and for a moment, he felt that Covington was letting him go, as though the town knew he no longer belonged to the cycle. But then the fog enveloped him again, pulling him back to the center of his own struggle, making it clear that the battle was far from over. Lucas knew he was nearing the end. After pushing the controls in the lab, he could feel that Covington was reacting like a wounded animal, trying to protect itself while its core pulsed with an angry, hostile energy. As he stepped outside, he saw that the town had changed once again. The buildings looked distorted, the streets had narrowed, and the fog that encircled him was now even denser, as if it were trying to enclose him completely. He could feel the town fighting against him, but he refused to give up. He walked down the main street, which now felt unfamiliar and twisted, with the houses and shops leaning in impossible directions. Covington was folding in on itself, as though it had lost all logic. Lucas knew the town was trying to confuse him, but he stayed focused. He needed to find Sophia again, or someone else who could help him understand what was happening. But the town seemed empty, with no sign of the residents he had seen before. It was as if Covington were deserted, leaving only him. As he walked, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, but no one was there. The sound continued, echoing through the empty streets, until he realized it was the rhythm of the town itself pulsing around him, like a furious heart. He started to run, trying to escape the oppressive feeling, but every corner he turned brought him back to the same place. Covington was closing in on him, and Lucas could feel he had lost control of his movements. He stopped in the center of town, trying to figure out his next move. He looked up and saw the sky covered in a swirling gray mass, spinning like a vortex, as if time itself were collapsing around him. The whole town seemed to be in a state of agony, and Lucas knew it was because of him. He had tampered with the controls, disrupting the delicate balance that kept everything in place. Now, Covington was trying to stabilize itself, and Lucas realized he was the price it was willing to pay to restore its order. As he stared into the vortex, he felt a presence beside him. Sophia was there, silent, with that same look of sadness in her eyes. "You shouldn't have done that, Lucas," she said, her tone not accusatory, but simply stating a fact. "The town won't forgive you." Lucas tried to explain himself, but she only shook her head, as if she understood something he couldn't grasp yet. "Covington is a prison, but it's also a home. And now, you belong to it. No matter what you do, the cycle can't be broken. The town always finds a way to heal itself." Lucas felt a wave of despair. He had believed he could escape, that somehow he could find a way out, but now he understood that Sophia was right. Covington was a closed loop, a place where time folded in on itself, swallowing everyone who ventured there. The town was a perfect trap, designed to catch those who sought answers to questions they should never have asked. He looked at Sophia, trying to understand how she could just accept her fate, how she had survived knowing she was trapped forever. "How can you just accept this?" he asked, his voice filled with frustration. Sophia sighed, as if she'd answered that question countless times. "It's not about accepting, Lucas. It's about becoming a part of it. Covington changes us. Slowly, we forget what was outside. The town becomes all we know. It becomes our world." Lucas felt his last hopes fading. He tried to remember the world outside of Covington, the people he knew, the stories he chased. But each memory felt distant, as if it were being erased, dissolving into the fog that now covered every corner of the town. He realized that Covington didn't just trap bodies, it devoured memories, turning its residents into shadows of who they once were, locked in a time that would never move forward. As he thought about it, he felt a strange peace washing over him. He realized he was surrendering, that resisting didn't make sense anymore. The town was absorbing him, and he knew that with each passing second, he was becoming more a part of the endless cycle. He looked at Sophia and felt, for the first time, that she might be right. Covington was a home for those who had nowhere else to go, a place where time stood still but life went on in an endless loop. Lucas took a step toward Sophia and felt the town embrace him, like a cold hug that was both comforting and suffocating. He knew that, like everyone else, he would be consumed by the town, transformed into just another fragment of Covington's distorted reality. But as he watched the swirling vortex above, he realized he had found a kind of redemption. He hadn't run away, but he hadn't fully surrendered either. Somehow, by altering the cycle, he had changed something, even if it was imperceptible. Sophia stepped closer, and they stood side by side, looking up at the sky spinning slowly above them. Lucas knew there was nothing more he could do, that his fate and Covington's were now intertwined. But he felt that, at least, he understood what the town represented, a place outside of time, where reality bent and where truth was as mutable as the town itself. He glanced at Sophia and smiled, and she returned his gaze with an understanding look. "Welcome to Covington, Lucas," she said, and he felt the weight of those words. It wasn't just a greeting, it was a sentence, a declaration that he now belonged to the town, that he was part of the cycle, just like everyone else. Lucas took a deep breath, feeling the heavy air in his lungs, and knew that the town had claimed him. As the streets around them seemed to dissolve into the fog, Lucas realized that Covington wasn't just a prison. It was a place of transformation, where time and life intertwined inextricably. He knew he was trapped, but he also knew there was something deeper, something he might never fully understand. And with that, Lucas accepted his fate, walking beside Sophia as the town closed in around them, absorbing them, transforming them into part of that endless cycle. In the end, Covington remained intact, suspended outside of time, unchanging and relentless. And Lucas, like Sophia and all the others, continued his path, trapped in a reality where time did not pass, where memories faded, and where the cycle would never end. The town was alive, and he was now one of its inhabitants, a fragment of an existence that would repeat forever, in the shadows of a world that never changed.